Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, is with us. For the past 40 years, Richard has been a registered Republican. He served 4 Republican presidents. Recently, he made national news when he announced he was resigning from the Republican Party and he was registering as unaffiliated. Richard is here to tell us why, and also to give us an idea of where Biden's foreign policy is going. We're pleased to welcome Richard Haass back to the program. Hi, Richard. You made national news recently when you resigned your party affiliation and said you're unaffiliated, like the know-nothings. What led you to do this, to take this momentous step, and what's the way forward for you politically?
Look, it was a sad day. I'd been a Republican for 40 years, beginning with Reagan. I've worked for 3 Republican presidents, though I've also worked for 1 Democratic president. But things had just reached a point, Jim, where I gave up hope, to put it bluntly, that the Republican Party could get back on a trajectory that I could respect and support. And I came to that conclusion, it was probably about now 8 months ago. Last summer, the news came out. More recently, I made it public in the aftermath of January 6th. I'd love to be proven wrong, but this is not the party I joined in terms of the relationship of government and the economy or society. No longer embraces a serious foreign policy, as best I can tell. It's become illiberal. Just the other day, I saw a poll where the lion's share of Republicans still think the election results were fraudulent. A surprising number are prepared to turn to violence to promote their political ends. I quoted Reagan when he left the Democratic Party, saying he didn't leave the Democratic Party, it left him. Well, that's where I came out on today's Republican Party.
Well, you are in good company. Ronald Reagan did it, so did John Lindsay, so did Winston Churchill, and so did 140,000 Republican voters in January who left the Republican Party, probably as a result of January 6th. But what I wanted to ask you was, did you do it because of Trump, or did you do it because of policy differences?
Well, the two are to some extent one and the same. Trumpism is likely to survive the man, and the man, even though he's at Mar-a-Lago, is not leaving the political scene anytime soon, as best I can tell. So he continues to have a large role and hold on the Republican Party. His ideas do as well. Now, the day may come when the Republican Party rediscovers its roots and becomes once again a Burkean conservative party. I just see none of that now. It's become a radical populist, big government party in many ways. And again, a wildly illiberal party against immigration, even though it's been one of the real drivers of American economic success. And let me be clear, being unaffiliated is not a great place to be. In many cases, like mine, you don't participate then in primaries. You feel to some extent as an outsider in American politics. Now, it turns out the plurality of Americans is in that position. Republicans are now down to, I don't know, what, roughly 25% of registered voters. But this country needs a 2-party system. We need 2 responsible parties.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because just moving to foreign policy, Biden said his foreign policy starts with the announcement that America is back, meaning that we can reinstate the alliances that Trump appeared to have undermined. And if we want to reinstate our alliances, how can other countries trust us, either our friends or our adversaries, where in 2 years, the Congress may turn Republican, and in 4 years, Trump may be back in office?
Well, the short answer is they cannot, which is why I'm sad to say the president's statement that America is back is at best partly true. Yes, it's back in the sense that we once again have in the White House an individual who fervently, to his core, believes in multilateralism. That to me is a welcome development. But we're not back in two ways. One is the way you suggested, that no one can assume the continuity is there, that if and when there's another rotation of power, that the United States will stand for the sorts of things that for the most part it stood for over 75 years under both Democrats and Republicans. The other reason we're not back is the country's not back. It's not just COVID. It's not just the economy, but it's the lack of political consensus to do anything about infrastructure, about immigration, questions of race and racism and police reform. Inequality has grown. A lot of our urban centers, including the one you and I are connected to in New York, are really struggling. So no, we're not back. And it's going to take a while before we can once again become the kind of country that others will respect and emulate.
We're all vitally concerned with nuclear arms control. And nuclear arms control was an area where Trump really made no progress. He abrogated the treaty or the deal with Iran. He didn't make any progress with North Korea, and he didn't even extend the arms control treaty with the Russians, the START treaty. So Biden seems to be reversing this. I mean, he hasn't addressed North Korea, but he wants to reinstate the Iran deal, the JCPOA, and he also immediately extended for 5 years the arms control deal with the Russians, which was almost a no-brainer. So do you see his being successful in reversing Trump's policies? And is that what he means by America is back?
You're not going to much like my answer, I think. I think it's good that we extended the nuclear deal with the Russians, but we've got to accept the fact that this deal doesn't cover many of the new technologies, nor China. So it was a good step, but it's not a sufficient step. With North Korea continues to build nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. The administration's yet to articulate an approach. It's not clear to me that history suggests any approach will work. If by work you mean for North Korea to denuclearize, I think the best you can hope for is some type of constraints, perhaps, or ceilings on North Korea. But they're not going to give up nuclear weapons or delivery systems. It's on Iran that I disagree the most. I don't think getting back into the 2015 so-called JCPOA, the nuclear deal, is a wise idea. The problem is that Iran could come back into compliance, but even if it were under compliance, it could still, over time, begin to edge closer and closer and closer to putting into place all the prerequisites of nuclear weapons. I thought it was a flawed agreement then. I think it's a flawed agreement now. It doesn't mean I thought or think that the Trump administration was right to unilaterally exit it without having anything better to put in its place. But to go back into it, I think, is simply going in the wrong direction.
Well, two of the great architects of the deal from our side were Tony Blinken and Robert Malley, both of whom are the leaders on getting back into JCPOA. So that doesn't really bode well for your position. It looks as if we'll, on some basis, get back into it. We may say we're going to improve it.
Two things.
Iranians say, no, just get back in.
Easier said than done. In order to get back in, there's a real question of sequencing, of timing, of which of our many sanctions would have to be rescinded, which could stay in place. Many of our sanctions, as you know, are unrelated to the nuclear deal. They have to do with terrorism, human rights, support for proxy groups, and so forth. I think what we should do is ignore the agreement and simply have set of understandings with Iran. This is what we will find permissible. If you go beyond these things, here's the price you will pay. If, however, you are willing to live under certain constraints, here's some of the benefits that might accrue to you. I could imagine, for example, some selective loosening of sanctions. And I think we ought to arrange these understandings with our European partners and also with several countries in the Middle East, including Israel and Saudi Arabia. But trying to nail it down either in the old agreement or in some new formal agreement, I think, is a pipe dream.
Well, we'll have to see how it plays out. Let's move on to Afghanistan, a country that you worked when you were in government. Where do we stand there? There seemed to be a deal with the Taliban. The deal seems to have not to have held. There's now a military involvement. If we pull out now, clearly if Afghanistan winds up a failed terrorist kind of state. If we stay there, we're going to have a military engagement, which we don't particularly want. So really, I mean, should there be a surge of US forces in Afghanistan above the 2,500 that are already there?
Well, look, the agreement that was signed a year ago between the Trump administration and the Taliban, whatever else it wasn't a peace agreement. It was a U.S. get out of Afghanistan agreement. Taliban had no interest whatsoever in ever laying down their arms. They would pursue the civil war without us on the scene. Sooner or later, they would win. Then they would be free to once again invite in terrorist groups or others. So this is a terrible agreement. What I think we should do at a minimum is keep our 2,500 troops there, which is also then an anchor for between 8,000 and 10,000 NATO troops that are also on the ground. I think we might want to think about not increasing the amount of forces we station there, but periodically we might want to increase the presence. But mostly what we're doing there is we're not warfighting anymore. We're providing intelligence and training and logistical support for the Afghans. And I think that, coupled with long-term military and intelligence and diplomatic and above all economic aid, I think will help that government survive, keep control of the major cities. It won't give you peace. It won't give you a military victory. What it will do is preclude the Taliban from having a military victory. It's not a perfect outcome, but it's the least bad of the outcomes I can think of.
Let's talk a little bit about bipartisanship. I mean, you have written about the need for bipartisan foreign policy. That's what we've had since the end of World War II, largely. But now we've become so polarized, I don't know that a bipartisan foreign policy is attainable. What's your take on it?
I think it's selectively attainable. I can imagine important parts of our policy towards Mr. Putin's Russia could well be bipartisan: support for Ukraine, pushback against Russia, cyber behavior, strengthening NATO. I don't see any Republican opposition to what Joe Biden did, reversing Trump's position on pulling US troops out of Germany. So I think Russia policy could be significantly bipartisan, opposition to the Russians over trying to kill political opponents. I think large elements of China policy could probably be bipartisan. We saw in the last administration, the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement derived or garnered bipartisan support. So that is something. I think Iran, probably not. North Korea, difficult. If we, for example, try to get Saudi Arabia into some sort of a peace deal with Israel, I think that would obviously have bipartisan support in the same way the Abraham Accords did. So I think the answer is, one, selectively it's possible. And two, as you know, when it comes to foreign policy, congressional involvement is not nearly as significant or central as it is on domestic policy. So to me, the real test of bipartisanship really won't be on foreign policy. Almost nothing anymore is submitted as a treaty. We never formally really declare wars anymore. The real test of bipartisanship is going to be on economic policy and the full range of domestic policies, from healthcare to infrastructure to what have you.
Well, let's take Russia. Traditionally, a new president takes office and he talks about reset. That's what Obama talked about. And we've had a history of set and reset, none of which has worked. And we have Biden coming in. We have what observers have called a lousy relationship with Russia right now. They've been particularly bad actors in recent days. Putin poisoning his political enemies, aggression against Ukraine and the like. And then he has all these domestic protests and disturbances, which may impel him to do more cyber damage than he's done already in Western countries. So one would think we ought to push back against that. Trump didn't push back against any of it. Do you think Biden will, and can he do it successfully with bipartisan support?
The short answer is yes. He already has pushed back in one thing I mentioned, which is not pulling US troops out of Germany. I think you'll probably see various measures to strengthen NATO. I think you'll continue to see military support for Ukraine. Look, we ought to make our cyber systems much less vulnerable. If we need to push back in cyberspace, we can do it. These protests have their own dynamic, which I think is healthy. We don't need to put our fingerprints on them, which could only discredit them. If Mr. Putin is tempted to look to foreign aggression to distract attention, we ought to make clear that it's not going to pay. So that to me it's almost that straightforward. I'll say one other thing. What's so clear to me about Putinism, Jim, is I don't see where in any way it's institutionalized. Even Mr. Putin one day will disappear from the scene, whether it's by natural causes or some other causes. I don't know if it's in a month or in a decade or what have you. He's there to what, 36 now. But the day after, there is nothing institutionalized. This is a kleptocracy. This is a government without legitimacy. It clearly does not enjoy widespread support in the country. The economy is narrowly based on energy. It's not a real modern economy. Demographics are in decline. So I actually think Putin's legacy will ultimately be not his foreign policy successes. I think it's quite possible when you and I do a show in 15 years that Putin's legacy is going to be, God willing, it's going to be domestic failure. And so I just think we have to wait Mr. Putin out, take away his opportunities to cause mischief as best we can, and just wait him out.
Okay, now, Churchill said that Russia was a riddle inside, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. China is as well. So we have a lousy relationship with China. There's another challenge for the president. What do we do about China? I mean, the only thing I think of doing is call in Richard Haass.
No, this is good for those of us in the foreign policy business. No shortage of issues to work on. The relationship with China is actually, it's gotten rougher over the last few years. Again, there's been a large degree of bipartisan continuity. The common thread is Xi Jinping. He has made China much more repressive at home. He has not in any way improved China's economic behavior in terms of respect for intellectual property. The government's not gotten out of the subsidy business. And obviously, China is getting much more muscular in its foreign policy in terms of what it's doing in the South China Sea or what it's threatening against Taiwan and Japan. And again, there's bipartisan agreement in this country to push back. So I think our policy ought to be to push back, but keep open economic behavior that does not deal with sensitive technologies. We ought to keep open dialogue, say on North Korea, where China is still in a position to have a big impact. Keep open dialogue on Afghanistan, which China borders. Keep open dialogue on infectious disease and climate change. And the tricky part for Tony Blinken and his colleagues will be, how do you manage a relationship that has elements of cooperation, elements of competition, and potentially even elements of confrontation? How do you manage that at one at the same time? It puts a real premium on diplomacy, but I think that's where we are with China for the foreseeable future.
How about insisting on democracy and human rights, which we've tried to peddle around the world? And China particularly, Pompeo said they were guilty of genocide. And we have, the Biden administration has adopted that, at least for the time being. I mean, how do we have economic relations with a country that's guilty of genocide?
Let me say two things. One is use the word insisting. We can't insist on human rights for two reasons. We don't have that kind of influence with China. We learned that 30 years ago after Tiananmen Square. We learned it now with Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. China is in a position, if you will, to pay any price that we introduce. Plus, we also have interests with China, so we don't have the luxury of hinging the entire relationship on human rights. We have to think about strategic and economic matters in North Korea and the like. So we can use our voice, we can use our influence, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. We're not in a position to insist.
Well, you wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home, and clearly we have to clean our own house. I hope we can do it. I hope we can do it politically. But what about Biden's domestic challenges? I mean, do you think his $1.9 trillion COVID relief plan is going to give us stimulus? Do you think it's going to really provide COVID relief to the people who need it most? Or is it just a big government handout? And I'm speaking to you as a former Republican.
Look, I'm already on record as skeptical or critical of the plan. We've already provided something on the order of $4 trillion of stimulus, fiscal stimulus. This would get us up to $6 trillion. Even without it, our economy is going to grow gangbusters before the end of the year as the vaccines and mask wearing and the rest kick in. Already, we're beginning to see some interesting numbers. Numbers of job openings, more jobs are being posted. We're also seeing inflationary pressures pick up. We're seeing it in the longer term bond markets. So I think this added stimulus is almost more of a political statement in many ways than an economic necessity. Do we need money? Sure. You need money for COVID related actions. Certain municipalities need money. Certain people really at the lower end of the of the income spectrum need help. But this is way too broad gauge. My hunch is probably something half or 2/3 as big would be plenty big. This is the Democratic equivalent of the Republicans lowering the corporate tax rate all the way down to 21%, when 28% would have done just fine. My guess is the administration, if it does get most of it through via reconciliation, where it doesn't need Republican support, my guess is it may rue the day, because I think sometime then over the course of the next couple of years, it's going to force Mr. Powell, among other things, to raise interest rates faster and sooner than the administration might want.
This is Jerry Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. We're coming to the end, and I wanted to ask you about truth. An important, really an essential element in democracy. And in the last 4 years, we have a president who told 30,000 lies in office, as many as 500 in one day, according to the Washington Post, after a reliable count. Rand Corporation did a report where they referred to the truth decay in our society. Now, do you see Biden able to remedy that when such a large portion of the 70 odd million who voted for Trump think he won the election?
He can remedy it in one way, by speaking the truth. And everything I know about the man leads me to think he will do that day in, day out. There's a lot of resistance to this. As you point out, probably 85% of the people who voted for Donald Trump think the election was fraudulent. So the big lie, quote unquote, has taken hold. And more broadly, given Fox, given AM talk radio, given the internet, it is really hard to have a serious public debate. You know, Pat Moynihan's old comment, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, just not his own set of facts. Well, the problem is we're trying to have serious public debate where people are putting forth things that they're calling facts that in fact are not, and they're denying facts which are in fact are. And that's a tough situation. Now, out of the 74 million people, I think the real challenge is not whether you can get all of them. Of course you can. There will always be a hardcore you can't reach. To me, the question is whether there's maybe 10 or 20 or 25 million of those people who you can reach, who you can in some ways bring back into a more traditional political space and debate. And that is an optimistic but not unreasonable goal. I also think it's an essential goal if American democracy is going to survive long into the future. So I would focus on that. And I haven't given up by any means the hopes that we can get there.
Do you think the Supreme Court has any impact when they finally came around, as they did, to acknowledging that Biden won the election and Trump lost unanimously?
Yes, this is your purview, and it shows that even people appointed by Donald Trump or by previous Republican presidents still put the law before their own personal political preferences. Conservatives believe in institutions. What makes a conservative in the traditional sense is you don't allow the immediate stakes, however passionate you feel about them, take precedence over the long-term viability of institutions and norms. That's what makes a conservative a conservative. You don't choose what's convenient over what's right. So when I see the court doing these things, I go, don't give up on American democracy.
Don't give up on America and don't give up on American democracy. So I have a question for you, Richard Haass, and the question is, why are so many people, including thoughtful people, leaving the Republican Party?
That's where we began our conversation, because it's not clear for the foreseeable future this Republican Party can, if I may use a health metaphor, which is appropriate today, can rid itself of the fever. But right now, we do not have a conservative or center-right party. What we have is a far-right populist fringe party that is not healthy for the republic, not healthy for our democracy. So either, again, the Republican Party has to once again, one day, become a center-right party, or we'll need a new one.
So our democracy is at the moment the victim of something like a pandemic. I thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous, terrific interview. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Good luck, take care, be safe, and all the best.